listener production.
Hi, Simon Beaton with you. Baby Reindeer is one of Netflix's biggest shows of 2024. It tells the story of Donnie, played by British comedian Richard Gadd, who befriends a woman who walks into the pub he works at. The woman, Martha, becomes a serial stalker and Donnie's life spirals out of control as he tries everything he can to distance himself from Martha's grip. The series starts with Netflix saying this is a true story, and Gadd, who plays himself, has since repeated the claims that it is. Well, the woman who Martha is apparently based on, Scottish lawyer Fiona Harvey, says the story is a fabrication. And she's now suing Netflix for $170 million. Jahan Kalantar is a Sydney-based solicitor, university lecturer and entrepreneur who calls himself the little guy lawyer. Jahan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Harvey is suing the show for defamation, negligence, intentional infliction of emotional distress and violations of right of publicity, among other charges. Here she is talking to Piers Morgan.
I'm not a stalker. I've not been to jail. I've not got injunctions, interdicts. This is just complete nonsense.
Surely that would be very simple to prove.
I think it's really interesting that as this story has gained traction, there's been people who've come out in support of, Richard Gadd's side, people who've come out in support of her side. And, there's obviously some very basic things that can be checked in relation to whether or not someone's been convicted of a criminal offence. So I don't know if they did take place. I'd be surprised if they didn't.
Yeah, well, the show suggested that Harvey or Martha had sent 40,000 emails to Gadd. Surely he and Netflix would be able to produce evidence of that level of stalking.
Absolutely. And I think that there are things such as, whether or not there's a certification that you did receive a criminal sentence, whether or not you did, for example, have the equivalent of a restraining order placed on you.
Yeah, so I can't really imagine Netflix would be in the business of making unsubstantiated claims about people and certainly not making an entire series based on potential untruths. Why do you think it hasn't verified its claims?
I don't know if it hasn't. I mean, from when I was reading the most recent update, it appears to me that Netflix intends to defend the claim. You have to understand that with the American legal system, it's quite different to the Australian legal system in that in Australia, the loser pays the other side's costs, which makes it very, very risky to take on cases where you don't at least have some sort of basis to do so. Where in the United States, it's not uncommon for plaintiff cases to be filed on behalf of individuals. And if you lose, you don't pay the other side's legal fees. And so you're only out of time. And so there's every incentive for someone to bring a case in circumstances where there may not be remuneration at the end because they believe that there is a possibility that they'll succeed, one. And two, they sometimes get a deal where they get a percentage of the pot of the outcome.
Oh, okay.
Which is, it's different to the way things are done here. Now, I'm not saying anything about her representatives, etc. That's just an observation that we've had, and which is why sometimes when you look at American lawsuits, you'll see lawsuits that would, quite strange, like McDonald's coffee and other ones that you don't think would really get to somewhere. And so this could be a case like that, or it could be a perfectly valid case of a poor woman who's had her name destroyed with no real basis. We won't know until the evidence is compiled. At this stage, she's filed her lawsuit, which consists of allegations and response to allegations, and Netflix is now in a position to respond.
Yeah, so the Daily Mail newspaper reported last month that Gadd told makers Clerkenwell Films that his stalker was never convicted. It claimed it had spoken to people close to the production who said Gadd told Clerkenwell that the stalker was the subject of an exclusion order, quote unquote, a civil order and not the same as a criminal conviction of stalking. It's hard to imagine Netflix would have signed off on the claim this is a true story.
It's unusual, and I think that I am going to be watching this with keen interest because, production companies, it's streaming services, they produce a lot of content, and maybe stuff falls through the hole sometimes, or maybe it doesn't, right?
Well, on that, Netflix executive Benjamin King addressed a House of Commons committee in London, and I've got some audio of that too.
Baby Reindeer is an extraordinary story. And it is obviously a true story of the horrific abuse that the writer and protagonist Richard Gadd suffered at the hands of a convicted stalker.
So Netflix appears to be sticking to its story?
Absolutely. And I think that one of the interesting things that I saw is that whether or not And this is something that I think needs to be considered, whether or not she did do these awful things that were said of her. I think there is a real question around whether a duty is owed to an individual who's portrayed in such a light in front of the world to have their identity obscured so that it can't be found. I mean, people went through Richard Gadd's history and his things, found who she was, and began to send her the most atrocious threats. Now, he said don't do that, but you've cast someone who bears, in my view, a striking similarity physically, and you've created a story which really enables people to go after this person. And that's what happened.
Well, do you think that Netflix were expecting that armchair detectives would work out who it was?
I think that if you're the size of Netflix, you would be insane not to think that if something catches any traction, something like that will take place. I think that the world that we live in now is so interconnected, and the world that we live in is so rife with digital breadcrumbs that it is absolutely, it would shock me if people didn't find it, even if it wasn't so popular.
Yeah, well, Harvey is an independent person, and going out on a limb suing a massive streaming giant like Netflix is quite massive. I've got a little bit more audio. This is, again, from her interview with Piers Morgan. Have a listen.
The fundamental point of this is, did you take part in this? Did you go to jail? Did you have a trial?
Of course not. Of course not.
Have you ever been to prison?
No.
Have you ever been charged with a criminal offence?
No.
Never?
No.
Nothing?
Is this a David and Goliath case?
Potentially, or potentially it's someone who's very unwell and believes things that may be, the basis of, mental health challenges. We don't know. That's why this is going to be such an interesting case. And I imagine that probably what will be done is some sort of offer to settle it will take place, and this will never see the inside of a courtroom, as cases like this rarely do. It'd be fascinating if it did.
One last question. Have we got any other examples of this happening before? Is there a precedence from previous cases like this?
I don't think there is. I mean, I've spent a lot of time observing this case and the cases around it. I don't think there's ever been anything quite like it. We're observing history in the making. But as we see more and more content like this being produced, people telling their stories, and their stories inherently having, from their viewpoint, a villain, it's going to be very interesting to see what this does for opening this moving forward.
Is this good for Netflix? Is this just keeping Baby Reindeer in the headlines?
Well, through one lens of the world, what is it? Talk good about me, talk bad about me, just talk about me. This is going to keep Baby Reindeer in the forefront of public discourse. It's going to keep people talking about it. It's going to get people to stream it, watch it. People who haven't heard of it might think, oh my gosh, I've got to check this out. I might subscribe to Netflix. So through a particular vein, this is something really good because it's going to keep people on the platform. So through that interpretation, it might very well be the case. And it's so important to note that at this stage, somebody said something, someone else is responding to what's been said. We just don't know the truth of it. And that's what trials are supposed to do. They're supposed to help us get at least some facsimile of the truth. So it'll be really interesting to see how far this goes.
How long do you think it will take before we see the end of this?
How long is a piece of string? It'll be it'll be very, very long, I think. There's going to be interrogatories and interlocutories and all sorts of steps. It's going to be a very long time before there's any resolution, if there is any resolution at all.
Even if they settle?
No, if they settle, it'll probably be under confidential terms. We'll never know. We'll just see something that says Netflix, some anodyne statement that Netflix and Miss Harvey have resolved their dispute on a basis, and that's the end of it.
Jahan, always so great to get you in here for the briefing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Jahan Kallantar, a Sydney-based solicitor, university lecturer, and entrepreneur. Thanks for listening to today's briefing. That's all for this episode. Don't forget to check your feed tomorrow morning for more. Antoinette, what have we got on?
I chat with artist Nathan Patterson, and this is a really personal and interesting discussion for me. Nathan Patterson is somebody I went to school with. I knew him quite well until he got kicked out of school, got into trouble with the law, and then he went to jail for 13 years for a series of crimes. Upon his latest release from jail, he turned to art and very quickly became an internationally acclaimed artist. In this really raw and honest chat, he talks about how difficult it is to stay out of trouble and to stay on the right side of law, and how he hopes that art and becoming a father will keep him on the right side of the law.
Sounds so interesting. And a reminder, we put out full eps of our weekend briefing chats on YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom to see them. You can also catch up with our other video content on TikTok at Listener Newsroom and on Instagram, which is at The Briefing Podcast. And if you like this ep, why not share it with someone you think might enjoy it too? I'm Simon Beaton. See you next time.